Good morning. I'm Kori. I lead the Foreign and Defense Policy team at the American Enterprise Institute, and it is my privilege today to welcome the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee and representative of the 9th District of the state of Washington to AEI. Adam Smith is the chairman of House Armed Services. He is a deep expert in defense policy, having been on the committee since 1997. And in addition to his expertise on defense, he's an advocate of more balanced national security spending, by which we mean increasing what we commit to the diplomatic and assistance arms. And he's been an ardent advocate of poverty alleviation, of educational opportunity, and governance as important parts of American foreign assistance. And we also have with us AEI's own defense budget and strategy sharpshooter, Mackenzie Eaglen. If you haven't yet seen her report on the 2020's Modernization Challenge, it is outstanding. Let us start this morning, though, hearing from Congressman Smith.
Thank you. You want me to go over there, or do I just
As you wish.
All right, I'll just sit here, actually. It seems weird to stand up. As we're getting ready to release the FY23 budget, this is probably the most impactful and important budget that we've seen in the 25 years I've been in Congress. Because we are really at a pivot point that comes down to a central question, and that is, what is the U.S. role in the world? And we've gone through the post-Cold War world and the post-Cold War world, trying to figure out how that fits. But certainly the events in Ukraine, what China has been doing in terms of threatening Taiwan, have brought, I think, a certain clarity to what the world is. I think we had hoped after the end of the Cold War that we could get to a place of greater peace and stability, where sort of a community of nations, at least that was my vision and the vision of many, would work together to confront global problems. We wouldn't always agree. Certainly there would be competition, there would be challenges in different places, but a lot of the bipolar conflict world that we had lived in with the Soviet Union, we could move past that. That's sadly for the moment not going to happen, at least not to the degree that we would like. And the U.S. has to play a role in that. And I think when we start talking about what our force posture should be, what should the Department of Defense do with its budget going forward, that's right at the center. What's our role in the world? What does the world look like? And I think at this point, it's pretty clear what our role in the world should be. And that is, we are fighting for economic and political freedom. We are fighting for a world where people have greater freedom of choice in terms of how to govern themselves. Nations have that freedom of choice in terms of how to govern themselves. And you have that greater equality of opportunity and equality of decision making. On the other hand, it's very clear that what Russia and China are doing is they are trying to make the world safe for dictatorship and repressive regimes. That has sort of become a central part of the way they look at the world and the relationships that they build. And I'm not going to get into the long-winded argument about why it's important to stop that. I'll take it for granted at the moment. If people have questions about it, happy to answer them. But the role that the U.S. has to play in that is great. And I know it's not easy and it's challenging, and I know we have challenges here at home. I will even completely admit and even advocate for the idea that one of the best ways that we can make the case for economic and political freedom in our model of government is by leading by example. Okay, is by having a country that actually provides for its people, that meets challenges like income inequality and climate change, and actually shows that we fully embrace and support democracy. So certainly we have work to do here at home, but just because of our historical role, because of the size of our economy and the size of our military and the size of our might, whether we want to or not, our actions will impact the rest of the world. So we might as well try at any rate, to do it in an affirmative and positive way as we go out and engage in the world and move forward. And I think we have the opportunity to do that. I think there's a strong bipartisan consensus for this. And the military has to play a role in that. Deterrence matters. I think when you look at Ukraine, if Putin had thought that he couldn't do what he's doing right now. If Ukraine had had a more robust military, he wouldn't be doing it. And so as we look at the other nations in Eastern Europe as a starting point, the Baltics, Poland, Romania, shoring up our NATO responsibilities, deterrence is one way to keep peace in the world. It's simply true. And I'm sorry, I want to make one other point back on the, why our approach is better. And Eastern Europe is the best example of that. I've been there twice in the last 6 months, in Ukraine back in August, but Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Romania. And you can look at the history of what those countries were under Soviet rule or the Warsaw Pact, in the case of Poland and Romania, and what they are now as economically and politically free people. It's night and day. I mean, I was in Estonia, a very small country, but an economic backwater, one of the poorest countries in the Northern Hemisphere under the Soviet Union, is now prosperous and successful because bottom line, economic and political freedom work for people. It is something worth standing up for and worth playing a role in. So as we are looking at our role in the world, we have to be mindful of that. And one other thing that's really important before getting into the specifics of what the Pentagon needs to do, we cannot do this alone. And that, when you look back over the last 30 years and start thinking about what could we have done differently so that we would be in that better place that I think we all envisioned in the mid-90s, one of the biggest mistakes was this neoconservative idea of the new American century, that the key in U.S. policy was that we had to make sure that the U.S. remained the dominant power in the world, as opposed to looking at it as an opportunity to build partnerships. And when we're talking about meeting the threat environment that we face, we cannot do it alone. American first is one of the more idiotic policy formulations I've ever heard in my life because it doesn't even serve America's interests. We have to work cooperatively with the rest of the world. Our ability to stand up to Russia is so much greater because of all the nations that are now standing with us. No doubt about it. Our ability to stop China from taking Taiwan in the same way that Putin is trying to take Ukraine right now is entirely dependent upon our alliances and our partnerships in the world. And if we treat them as second-class citizens, as subservient to our needs, we will not succeed. Now, when we look at the force posture, we start with the basic principle. I made this joke in committee yesterday. I'll give out an award for someone who comes up with an acronym or a mnemonic for this, but it's China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and transnational terrorist threats. That's the threat environment. And that's going to ebb and flow in terms of what's more important and how we meet those challenges. But we need to be in a position to deter those adversaries and to build a military that can do that. That certainly means that we need a stronger NATO and a stronger presence for the U.S. and NATO in Europe to deter Russia. It also means that we need a stronger presence in Asia to help deter China, and also stronger partnerships. At dinner at the Australian Embassy last night, the AUKUS agreement, the emerging Quad agreement between Australia, Japan, India, and the U.S. We have to build up those partnerships and strengthen those partnerships as we attempt to deter our adversaries and create that world that we're talking about. In terms of what our force posture is, the only final piece of that I'll say is we also can't ignore the rest of the world. A lot of the great power competition, if you will, is playing out in Africa. It's playing out elsewhere. I'm more familiar with Africa than I am with other places. But China is aggressively trying to build relationships across Africa with the ultimate goal of building more military bases. They've built one now in Djibouti. So we have to have a presence, but I don't think that presence needs to be a robust military presence. Most of what China is doing in Africa is economic. Now, security assistance is going to be part of it. We are pretty good at training and equipping security apparatuses, so we need to be engaged there. But that's the way we need to think about our force posture. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over for the vastly more interesting Q&A and discussions is as we build that military, we really got to be smart about using new technologies. Because everything that I just laid out is pretty intimidating in terms of cost. If you think about the type of military that we had to build to deter the Soviet Union back in the day. And if we have to build that many ships, that many planes, have that large of a force, even with partners, it becomes to be a little bit problematic in terms of being able to achieve it, and that's where technology comes in. And when you're thinking about how we need to change the force, think about two things: information and survivability. Those are the two keys. The ability to move information quickly, get it to the person who needs it the most in real time, and to protect that information infrastructure. It's the number one way that China is making us vulnerable, is through their cyber capabilities and their anti-satellite capabilities that could effectively take down our command and control and our ability to move information. And that leads into the survivability piece. You can have the biggest force in the world, if it's not survivable, if it can't get into the place that it needs to get into and fight, then it's really not doing you too much good. Now that's an iterative process. There's no like one thing, oh, we do this and we're good. It's going to be constantly moving and changing. They're going to be adjusting. We're going to have to adjust. AI, other technologies are going to be crucial. Drone technology is crucial. I'm really struck by some of the relatively small conflicts that have happened in the last few years, where that drone technology and that ability to move information has changed it. And I'm oversimplifying here. I haven't studied exactly what happened in Ethiopia, but the oversimplification is obviously there's a civil war going on there, and the people challenging the Ethiopian government had the upper hand, to the point where, I don't know if you remember, but they were telling us better get out of Addis Ababa because they're coming and the government's going to fall. Well, basically Ethiopia at that point went out and bought a bunch of drones from Turkey, the UAE, and Israel, and changed it like that. We're able to push the forces out, get back control of at least their portion of the country. That type of just use of new technology is going to be the key to deterrence. If China thinks that we have the ability to protect our systems and to be survivable and to make their systems vulnerable, that's the best deterrence we can have. It's not just a matter of building a lot of things. We have to make sure that those things meet the technological challenges of today's warfare. And all of this is coming to a head in the national security strategy, which was supposed to be released, I think, like this week, but now it's going to be, a few things have come up that have caused them to rethink exactly what that might look like. And we've got the nuclear posture review coming in. We've got the FY23 budget coming, which will show us what those priorities are within that space. But the bottom line is the defense posture is going to have to be reasonably robust going forward because of the threats we face from that little mnemonic that I don't have yet, for those 5 threats that are very real. We need to work in partnership with the rest of the world to meet them, but we cannot ignore them.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith, I think, for that powerful and principled description of what's going on in the world, of America's rightful role in shaping what's going on in the world, about the essential nature of having military forces and other American capabilities that can deter the advance of dangers, and for that fabulous and unusual example for many of us of what China is doing in other places and the importance of technology. It resonates a lot with a community committed to defending human dignity, expanding opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place. Mackenzie, we're in month 5, almost month 6 of continuing resolutions. What's going on? How much damage has the inability of the administration and Congress to act on the good work of Chairman Smith and the Armed Services Committee to pass the NDAA and get appropriations bills passed? What's going on there?
I applaud the chairman again on getting the defense policy bill over the finish line in what was a really particularly tricky. I know they're often tricky, but this was a particularly tricky year. So my kudos again to your committee and your leadership. But I know that you're as frustrated as I am, half a year-ish, give or take, of a spending freeze for the largest federal agency, combined with the impacts of inflation, right, running at levels not seen in 40 years. I think, would you agree? I call it inflation plus continuing resolution is sequestration by another name. The loss of buying power for the department is maybe $4 to $6 billion a month, based on my sort of rough calculations, taking examples like fuel costs are 5 times what they had planned, for example, and then kind of run that across all the accounts and priorities. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I don't know about the specifics of the numbers, but it's certainly a fair assessment that it hamstrings the effort. And I think, in this advertisement for electing legislators instead of celebrities, I just think that we have a real problem in the legislative body right now. And I've been a legislator for 32 years, and I've been blessed to be, I was the chairman of the Senate Law and Justice Committee for 4 years when I was a state senator, and I've been the chairman of this committee. I've been right in the middle of the process of actually trying to pass legislation. And it takes a slightly different approach and a slightly different skill set and a focus, as opposed to just, trying to tap into the outrage of the moment so that people will pay attention to you. And really, at the end of the day, that's what it amounts to. You get your social media up, you're on TV more, you raise a ton more money. Of all the terrible things that have happened in the last year plus, one smaller one that stands out for me is the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene raised $3 million in the first quarter of last year. That approach of just simply trying to kick over the furniture works in terms of raising money and getting to people to pay attention to you. If you actually want to pass legislation, you have to listen to people who disagree with you. You have to, pause for the moment and contemplate the possibility that you might be wrong. And you also have to realize that compromise has value. Okay, you don't get everything you want, but you get something done. Okay, so I implore the American electorate, please factor that in when you're trying to figure out who to elect, because if it's just chaos, it's not good for anybody.
Yeah. We have an important project here at AEI led by Yuval Levin on strengthening the role of Congress, and so many of their recommendations really support exactly what you're saying. Mackenzie, we clearly have a mismatch between the nature of the threats we're facing, the ability of us as a military and as a government and as a society to deter threats to them. Of course, you can narrow your strategy, you can expand your resources, or you can innovate. And I really appreciated Congressman Smith's emphasis on innovation. How are we doing on that? You just wrote a big report on modernization.
I mean, I'm nervous. It's not that there's not good news stories in the department. You can pick them off, occasionally here and there. But I'm generally nervous overall. The former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs, on his way out the door, got honest and talked about how everything's the same, nothing has changed, too risk averse, too slow, too scared, nothing happens fast in the department still. And of course, he led the JROC. So I'm thinking, well, then if you can't fix this, and I know there's a variety of commissions that are going to do great work for thinking this through for Congress, hopefully coming up with good ideas. But I don't know if you saw the resignation of the Air Force's chief software officer and his very public LinkedIn, takedown of the department. I think that sort of applies, not universally, but almost in the bureaucracy. So I'm nervous. I'm nervous for a couple of reasons, obviously all of those. But then I'm okay with this debate about legacy systems, but some are still used. Obviously, putting aside the B-52, and that's obviously a classic case of Eisenhower-era things being repackaged and repurposed for modern-day capability. But in some cases, legacy equipment is our playground for innovation. And Congress has been the only reason the department hasn't given it all away overnight, whether that's fleets and inventories of ships and vehicles and aircraft. So I'm nervous. I wish it were better news, because I think you've been pouring enough money into, there's basically been record research and development, test and evaluation, and science and technology money going to the department since the Obama administration, give or take the budget year. I'm not seeing enough move into procurement and yield fruit. Do you agree?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of sort of small bore little pieces of how we get to that more faster, more innovative, DoD procurement, acquisition, and all of that. I met with the head of R&E yesterday, and I think she's got the right approach. And one of the small bore things we're trying to figure out, we've done a pretty good job of putting the investments in R&E and R&D. But then once you get it, moving from there to actually buying it, and that's the valley of death that people have talked about. I think we need to give the Pentagon greater freedom to do that. But overall, it's really just a matter of how you approach problem solving. And the culture in the Pentagon is in the exact wrong direction. And I've said this 1,000 times, and I got a whole bunch of different analogies for it. But the bottom line is you've got to be focused on problem solving instead of process. Okay?
Yes.
You have to sort of figure out, well, I have a soccer analogy, which I'll go ahead and throw out there. When my son was 4 years old, first soccer game he played, he had a very good coach who understood all manner of different things about soccer. She was a high school coach. But, 4-year-old kids are out there, they're like running around in circles. So after the game, I took my son back up to the field and I said, look, there's a hell of a lot going on here. But at the end of the day, it comes down to this. Your job is to put this ball in that goal. Okay? How you want to do it is entirely up to you. But that's what we're trying to do. My son went on to be a very, very, he scored 7 goals in the next game, scored a whole lot throughout the rest of his career before giving up and deciding not to go to Division III and stopping at high school. But the point is, I think he took my words to heart. And that's what
Mission
I
command.
want to tell the Pentagon. You got to be mission focused and creative, and they're not. They are process focused.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to figure out, what's the equivalent of taking the Pentagon up to the soccer field and showing them the ball. Number one is we have to be clear on what our goals are. Okay, and that's why I think this moment is such a huge moment. It's a huge moment for me. Until I sat down, 2 weeks ago now, when I was in Poland and got the brief on what we knew about what the Russians were up to, I couldn't believe that he was going to do this. Okay, I sit in these briefs and I do all this stuff and I know all this. I still was like, come on, that's just crazy. All right, because the world that I grew up in mostly, or as an adult anyway. This stuff didn't happen, okay? The Cold War was over. We no longer had to worry about that. We don't do this stuff, okay? But now it's very clear that that has changed, and I hope that will focus the mind. So what are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish? But then just to change that overall attitude, I've joked that one of the things I'd like to do is, a la Thanos in the Marvel universe there, snap my fingers and eliminate half of the requirements currently in the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And I really don't give a rip which half,
Yeah.
okay? Let's just start there. Let's just get rid of half of them and see what we can do
Yeah.
from that point.
Yeah. Agree.
Something, because, I always go in and say, everyone's got these examples, and the latest example I had is, visiting Vigor Shipyard where they're remodeling an LCS ship, the USS Gabby Giffords, as a matter of fact. And Senator Kelly and Gabby were with me as we visited the ship. But one of the guys took me aside and said, we're repainting the hull below the waterline, basically. There are 1,200 pages of requirements for what you have to do to repaint beneath the waterline on a ship. And if you're going to do that, you got to go through all 1,200 frickin' pages and make sure that you check each box, okay?
Wow.
So there's a bunch of different things we can do here, but it is a mindset. And I've worked with people that there's just a way of looking at the world that says, I'm going to be creative and solve the problem, and then there's a way of looking at the world that's like, I really don't trust myself, so, I'm just going to make sure that I'm doing what I know people expect, and then we can all feel good when we've failed, that we've checked all of the boxes. And let me say one final thing on this point.
I got to quote you on that.
You can also, this is a culture, okay? Because, I have also had a lot of people work for me now in the course of 32 years, and a lot of them come in with that mindset. But we've built a staff that has the different approach, and you can see them go, you know what? This is better. I like this. I could do this. If you set the culture, people will meet that culture. And we're just not there. And I think the vice chair is right. We are not there at the Pentagon yet.
That is such an important, culture drives everything else. As you were giving those examples, I was reminded of the military historian Andrew Gordon, who wrote an excellent book called Rules of the Game, about the decline of professionalism and warfighting ability in the Royal Navy from the Battle of Trafalgar to the Battle of Jutland. And he identifies 2 different mindsets. One are rat catchers, the people who focus on, I've got a problem, how do I fix it?
Right.
And those are the people who win wars. And regulators, who are the military people we tend to promote in a peacetime military because they follow the rules, they check all the boxes, and those are the people who lose wars. And so the emboldenment of the mindset you talk about, I think, is such an empowering culture, and it's really important to drive that through the Pentagon if they're not going to drive it through themselves. Mackenzie, how do we do that?
So, are you thinking? I'm curious about your approach, because if I were chairman for the day or the year, I would. Is it time for, a major relook? Not like a Goldwater-Nichols 2.0, but something equivalent, something that big and consequential.
Yes.
Okay, where you're looking at all parts of this, not just one part.
And I've heard it described this way, and I don't know enough about management. I sort of instinctively came to this. I'm not like overwhelmingly educated in a whole bunch of different ways. I just don't like to lose. Okay, so if I'm trying to get something done, I'm like, I'm gonna do whatever I got to do to make sure that at the end of this I win. Okay, and that's just it's not. But from the overly educated standpoint, in the 60s, McNamara, ran forward and he was like, this is the way the Pentagon ought to run. And by and large, most people feel that's kind of the same way we're running it.
Yep.
And this is where we need people who have a lot more knowledge base than I do. But, there was a way that you ran an industrialized factory in the 50s
Right.
that worked. I mean, it made sense.
In the 50s.
But now, the way you run, a major, whether you're talking Microsoft, Apple, the way you run in an innovative economy, totally different economy. And we have not yet gone back and rewritten the rules.
That's right.
I don't know how to do that, but yes, we need to do that.
Mm-hmm. Makes me miss the great Senator McCain. Great late.
Yeah.
He'd be a good partner.
No, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Speaking of partners, it looks to me like there's a very strong bipartisan reaction to Russia's aggression and what we are seeing. Is that how it actually feels on Capitol Hill?
Yeah. I mean, there's the sort of slow undertinge of the Republicans wanting to blame Joe Biden for everything and take advantage of that opportunity. And they do mention that from time to time. But I think there is a very strong bipartisan feeling, in support of Ukraine. And this, by the way, right and left, one of the most impassioned, we got to go fight for Ukraine speeches I've heard in the last week was from Marcy Kaptur. And so it runs the spectrum. And yes, I think it has helped focus us a little bit past some of the more traditional partisan fights to, we got to come together on this. And yeah, it's as bipartisan a thing as I've seen in the last couple of years, to be sure.
That's fantastic. It would be a beautiful outcome of the courage of the people of Ukraine if they helped us focus on a bipartisan basis on the worldview, America's role in it, the importance of strong military and non-military forces in deterring that. Care to assign a probability of whether that bipartisanship can result in some of the kinds of changes for defense policy?
I think it's going to help. I will say that, one of the things I think that we need to do as we're doing this, and I'm somewhat cautious in my language as I talk about the role the U.S. plays in the world. I think we have to approach it with humility instead of triumphalism, if that's a word. Because one of the things is the whole, we're America, we're better than you, we're going to show you how to get it done, doesn't go over terribly well. Because certainly, we have made mistakes, particularly in the last 20 years. So as we're trying to rally the world, and I'll come back to sort of rallying the Congress in a moment, as we're trying to rally the world, I think a lot of the more skeptical places in the world who wouldn't necessarily buy into the idea that, American exceptionalism and all that goes into that, they're going to be looking for that humility. They're going to be looking for that cooperation and for that recognition that this is a partnership. The U.S. is indispensable. There's just no two ways about it. And when I was in Eastern Europe, they were happy about NATO, but they were laser-like focused on, is the U.S. coming? Are you going to put troops in our country? Because the World War II going forward, we mean something that nobody else means, and that presence is going to be there. But we have to be a little bit more humble about how we approach it and a little bit more willing to see the importance of the roles of other countries in the world if we're going to be successful at it. And also, think about what what's good for the individual nations in Africa that we're going to need, or the individual nations out there, and talk about development, take advantage of the China thing and how they do development in an incredibly mafia-like way that doesn't really help the countries they're working on. But yes, I think this will give us the ability, will give us a greater chance to make the changes we need to meet the challenge. I think it does.
It's terrific. And your point about helping countries solve the problems they're actually worried about, what I noticed when I was doing coalition stuff in government is that the United States comes rolling in and says, we have a problem and we need you to put everything aside and help us deal with our problem. And most other countries wish they could trade their problems for our problems.
Right.
And so actually working in a consistent way to help strengthen governance, to help strengthen economic opportunity.
It comes back to how you pass legislation, okay? And one of the ways I pass legislation is I'm always mindful of the fact that the people whose votes I'm trying to get, their problems are every little bit as important as mine, okay? I'm not coming in saying, all right, I got to do this. I know this is important. You have to be with me, because this is like, and obviously I wouldn't be pushing it if I didn't believe that. But if you're going to get it done, you got to think, okay, well, what does that person need? And I'm always thinking that way. These are the people we need to be on our side. How can I help them? And the same is, the case when you're going out and trying to work with other countries in the world and bring them in. I won't tell the specifics of the story, but I can't, because I can't. But, when I was trying to pass the very first defense bill, Senator Inhofe called me up and he wanted something. And when I told my staff this, they were like, oh, good God, we can't do that. And I said, no, you're looking at this the entirely wrong way. This is a really good thing, okay? This is a really good thing, because I'm going to get that for him, okay? And then we're going to find a way, because then it's a partnership, okay?
Yeah.
And then we're working together. And Putin is sort of showing the power of brute strength, but he's also showing the limitation of brute strength. And I know sometimes, I've got the votes, I've got the power, I'm just going to do this because I can. I get that. It's not a long-term sustainable approach to anything in this world, in my view.
Mm-hmm. It's an excellent point. Mackenzie, what are we not focused on in defense strategy and in the resourcing of that strategy? What's missing?
That's our next 2-hour event. Hope you tune in. Just kidding. Oh gosh, I don't even know where to go. I guess I want to drill down on posture, right? Because the money is the input, and the output, one of them, is our force posture and what we're able to do and where, based on kind of numbers and availability and readiness and capacity and so many other things. So, and I know this is a topic that you really wanted to drill down in today. Is the crisis in Eastern Europe an opportunity to fundamentally relook force posture? I know it's ironic. The Pentagon and White House just did that and affirmed the status quo before this invasion, arguably. But is this a moment to, for example, shift some forces permanently assigned to CENTCOM and put them closer to Eastern Europe? They're still available for contingencies in the Middle East as needed. Other changes, Indo-Pacific. What do you think?
Well, I think the number one biggest thing is this is going to give us more help. And we've already seen that. You've seen, Germany, and I think a lot of other countries are now going to up what they spend on defense. So we're going to have a lot more partners. And I would, and I will get to your specific question, but that's the number one biggest thing that we have to take advantage of. Because the thing that we are best at in the world is our military. Okay, not just we're just better at everything that goes into being an effective fighting force, and we're seeing that in Ukraine. That Russia is really not very good at this. Okay,
all of us are shocked that they're not better at this.
Yeah, I'm not, but because these lessons about how to be effective and efficient, it's hard, okay? Yeah. It's not just the Pentagon that doesn't do it well. And by the way, another point to put in the back of our mind is we got to stop acting like China and Russia are 1,000 feet tall, all right? They've got weaknesses, they've got faults, and we got to figure out what those are and exploit them instead of just going, oh my God, China. In fact, I was at this dinner last night and we were talking about all that stuff, and I finally said, all right, what's China's weaknesses? And everybody started speaking didn't answer the question. They said, well, but they're really good at this. It's like we just couldn't get off of that mindset. But anyway, the big thing is we will now have greater partners. We need to train them, make them better. We did this special operations training center that was set up in 2009 and worked with our NATO partners to train their special ops forces so that they could be more helpful to us in the counterterrorism fight. As these militaries grow, we need to be in there training them, helping them, and working together. Posture-wise, yes, we're going to need to do more in Eastern Europe. I don't think we can forget about Asia because the presence does matter.
Yes.
So I think we're going to need to balance between those two things. And as far as cost is concerned, I come back to we got to get more out of the money we spend so that we can do. And I believe that we can do that. I mean, you know this stuff. You've looked at this really closely in terms of think about all the money that we've wasted by making mistakes in terms of how we've built programs. Sure. Bring back those tens of billions of dollars going forward at least, and it puts us in a better position to do more.
Just a quick though on the cost. For this particular moment, an emergency supplemental saying emergency for you state AID, but not for you DOD. Do you think that's fair?
Well,
the conversations are ongoing with the appropriators.
Yeah, that's not true.
Okay.
Okay, I've spoken to the appropriators,
Great.
and they're perfectly willing to give DOD the emergency money on this. Now, as we discussed, just breaking news to me anyway. By the way, everything is not breaking news. It's just, and furthermore, I'll watch it even if it's not. It doesn't have to be breaking news to
Right,
get my attention.
disincentivize the
It's okay,
hyping of it.
But the supplemental ask is going to be, and I'm like, and a lot of that is for COVID relief, and it's even. So I don't know how that's going to sort of rattle the ship, but we're willing to do emergency supplemental money for DOD and the others as well.
I'm glad to hear that.
I think a lot of Asia experts are anxious, thinking that we've lost the bubble on the major long-term challenge, but I think the response to that is if we have a military that has to do one or the other, that has to do deterrence in Europe or deterrence in Asia, that probably tells us we're not getting enough out of our defense spending, and we probably need to think about force structure a lot more seriously. We have a ton of questions from the audience, so with your permission, I'm going to go to that now. The first one is that Chairman Smith, you offered support for a Pacific Deterrence Initiative concept last year, but funding has still been slow to emerge. Do you think the department is more or less focused on developing this concept in FY23? And if so, where are the new examples of growth? And Mackenzie, I'm going to hit you on that one too.
Yeah, I forget the number on it, but we have funded it in the $4 to $5 billion range. I think this is going to happen. And I met with the Indo-PACOM commander yesterday, and he was saying, for years in Indo-PACOM, they watched everything go to CENTCOM. Okay, which is why, by the way, it was so important to get out of Afghanistan. We can have that debate another time, and certainly I quibble with some of the ways it was done. But in terms of what our ability, number one, to actually make a difference on a problem, that's going to really help Indo-PACOM. The fact, at its peak, we had almost 200,000 troops deployed between Iraq and Afghanistan, and that number is now, I don't know where it's in the low thousands, maybe 10,000 at the most. That frees up resources. That gives more focus to Indo-PACOM, and I think that's an appropriate change in our force posture, is to prioritize, is to bring down the priority to some degree in CENTCOM, bring it up in Asia, and then Europe as well.
To some extent, Kori, I think there does need to be a zero-sum approach, to show, not just because perhaps the department has to, which I don't like, but to show seriousness of the long-term commitment to deterrence in Asia, and to signal in a variety of important ways and important messages. There's a variety of messages in that signaling about the Middle East. It doesn't mean it's not important, doesn't mean it won't come find us with challenges and problems in the future, but I think there's an opportunity. The pivot before it was the Obama pivot, the George W. Bush administration was talking about the need to sort of look that direction, and yet so little has changed, as many AEI scholars have written on the ground, so to speak, or at sea or in the air in the region. So I think it is, I'm supportive. I wonder, though, your thoughts, and I think the European Deterrence Initiative was very successful. I think, you were supportive of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. It's a little slow to get off the ground. The department wasn't kind of where Congress was at first, even though you told them repeatedly what you wanted to see in it. But I do worry a little bit about the long-term, what does this mean for combatant commanders basically having their own budget? And is that a fair assessment? And, the service chiefs getting kind of told what to do? Or do you see this PDI-EDI model enduring for a while?
I do. I think it will be enduring. I think, and I haven't actually been able to answer that question, because on the one hand, when I'm talking about, focus on the goal, the combatant commanders, they're the ones closest to the goal.
Yep.
So they should have greater control to go, hey, let's grab this. On the other hand, my experience with combatant commanders is they pretty much have the same approach, and that is, there's nothing going on in the world but what's going on in my AOR, right. And you have to give me absolutely everything. There's not a concept of sharing. So no, I don't think ultimately we can give combatant commanders that much power, because we train them to focus on their point. That's why we have the service secretaries, to look at the whole picture, not just one small piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent question here. In light of in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, what type of budget top line would Chairman Smith recommend or expect for FY23? Yes, it's about how we use the budget, but if the U.S. must shift more forces to Europe to shore up NATO allies, in addition to acknowledging that the Indo-Pacific remains the priority theater with China as our most important competitor, what new funding should be provided to meet those aims?
I haven't picked a number yet, but without question, it's going to have to be bigger than we thought. The Russian invasion of Ukraine fundamentally altered what our national security posture and what our defense posture needs to be. It made it more complicated, and it made it more expensive. I don't see much way to argue it now. I'm always going to be cautious of the people who always want to spend more money no matter what, and no matter how much you spend, it's not enough, and you got to spend more, because I think we lose track of the ability to be efficient in how we do it. But the decision to invade Ukraine by Russia, changes it, and it's going to go up. There's no doubt about it.
Mackenzie, I'd like to ask you the same question.
Yeah.
Between the equivalent of sequestration, the effects of the continuing resolutions, inflation, and the invasion of Ukraine, what top line would you recommend?
Well, I'm confident in Congress's ability to support contingency money. We just talked about the supplemental. But longer term, and even some of the shifts underneath the top line that I think you could make if you were to make them, I'd be looking at a budget that meets inflation at a minimum. And so that puts you over $800 billion, unfortunately. And I know that's for 051, that's a big, huge number. But historically, CBO has said, defense inflation is higher, depending on the account, 2 to 7 points above national inflation. And I think those trends are still hold true today. So that's just a sort of steady state, the challenge. But I'd be also interested in, as CR has lingered, equally important would be, for example, not to make all O&M money disappear in 6 months or to be returned to the Treasury. That could be just as effective as higher budgets. I'd be interested in more flexibility for the money. Yeah. Because they're not getting it. They're getting it in such a short time. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah. The flexibility point gets into the balancing. And look, if we're going to get to that world that we talked about earlier, that is focused more on problem solving and results, you have to give them more flexibility. Now, Congress doesn't like that. We like to be able to dictate for a whole wide variety of different reasons. And if we're going to get a more efficient government, for that matter, USAID, I've done a ton of work on that.
Yeah. And
Raj Shah was a friend of mine when he was USAID director. I used to talk to him a lot about the fact that, he had all these little boxes. He had problems, but, he couldn't use the money because it was here for that. Right. If we're really going to enable the type of flexibility throughout government, like I said, development, wherever, we're going to have to trust, bureaucrats a little bit more with the decision making. And I said, there's a lot of different ways to hold people accountable. Yeah. If they make bad decisions, fire them. Don't put them in a position where no matter what they do, they can't do their job well because they don't have the flexibility to do it.
Right. So I do have some actual breaking news, which is that votes have been called on Capitol Hill, so we need to spring you in about 5 minutes. I do want to get a couple more of the audience questions in before we
Sure.
let you go. The first is goes to technology points that you talked to earlier. With respect to the point about the need to move information and data around the world, does DoD need to do more to protect or make more robust undersea cables that carry the bulk of data and seem to be the objects of attack now?
Yeah, I don't, and the short answer is I don't know whether the undersea cables are crucial to that. I do know that protecting our systems, and this gets us back to innovation in software and technology and the need for a more rapid ability to do that. Of all the different pieces to that, I mean, certainly it'd be better if we could build the next generation F-35 4-class carrier more quickly, more efficiently, and better. But number one is the ability to protect our information and to protect our systems. You know, and that is about software, probably about AI and machine learning and all of that, whether it's a cable or wherever. You know, yes, we have got to focus on how to better protect our systems.
So I'm going to take 2 last questions in the room together and answer and go.
I've got a few more minutes. They hold the first vote open forever. I bet you they'll hold it open for almost an hour if they called it this quickly, because people were not expecting it. So
it is wonderful of you to be so generous with your time. Questions from the floor, please.
Chairman, thank you for your time. Tony Bertucca, Inside Defense. I wanted to talk about for a minute how maybe the crisis in Ukraine has maybe changed the way you approach your job to being chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. It seems like almost overnight a lot has changed. People are discussing things that I have not heard discussed before, especially maybe when it comes to nuclear posture and defense resources. If you could just maybe speak broadly and then about maybe your approach to the nuclear posture. I know we don't have the NPR done yet, but it seems like it's an area that's going to be debated. Thank you.
Well, like I said at the outset, this has really sort of brought a certain amount of clarity to the world we're living in, because there's been this ongoing struggle to, okay, well, it's not really the Cold War, but we still have threats, and how do we deal? I mean, it's brought clarity to our mission, in that our mission is to deter, adversaries who certainly will use aggressive military force to accomplish their means in a way that jeopardizes the peace and security of the world. And we got to figure out how to deter that, and the defense is going to be part of it. I think it has, and look, our committee has worked very well together on a bipartisan basis, but this has really ramped that up. I think that's the biggest change, is we have a more specifically shared purpose. Let's put it that way.
And then when it comes to the nuclear posture?
Yeah, that's a bit more complicated in that we knew where Russia was coming from in the first place, and nothing at the moment has really changed in that regard. It was in their defense doctrine to threaten nuclear weapons in a conflict like this. We knew that, so I don't know that it's changed that much, and really what's going to change it is when that nuclear posture review comes out.
Excellent. And here in the front.
Hi, thanks. Mike Stone from Reuters. You just talked about the supplemental. Were you saying that including both Ukraine and COVID relief in that will make it more difficult to pass?
Well, I mean, I don't know is the short answer. My initial thought is the much larger number will raise questions that most of us had not been contemplating. I mean, heading into today, and maybe people were more informed than I was, but we were looking at a number in the $7 billion range that was going to be humanitarian plus defense focused on Ukraine. Now to go from a $7 billion to a $32 billion, sadly, as you asked the question, I mean, off the top, you think it's going to make it more difficult. In some ways, it makes it easier because you're passing out more to more people. More people have an investment in it at that point. I don't know if it's going to make it easier or harder, but it definitely is different than what most of us were contemplating 24 hours ago.
My friends, won't you join me in thanking Congressman Adam Smith, the distinguished chairman of House Armed Services, for his time this morning, and not just for all the great things you do for this country's security, but the way you do them, which is so admirable. Thank you.